So we've seen a racking up of the violence recently amongst organised criminal groups that have close attachments to Turkey. If you look at cocaine coming into Europe, I know for a fact we've had many examples of the Turkish organised crime groups organising the transportation.
How did this happen? There ain't so many things that the Turkish people are known for. There's the Turkish serious, there's the Turkish textile, there's this and that.
The Turks and the Kurds of North London, who controlled criminal activity and the supply of drugs through brutality and fear.
There's also the Turkish Mafia.
I reached out to a former police officer, Ian Broughton, to understand the current situation on the streets.
I started my police career in Hackney in 1989 and quickly became aware of the presence of organised crime within the Turkish community. The Turkish organised crime groups, renowned for being difficult to catch, and they're usually associated with the heroin trade.
That's intriguing to me. The Turkish land doesn't even produce any drugs. Cocaine comes from South America, heroin comes from Afghanistan, and there are no mass ganja plantations in Anatolia. But somehow, the Turkish mafia operates internationally. How did this happen? How did the Turkish mafia become global? World domination in the drug industry requires a dominion over the whole supply chain. If you have the raw material, that's a good start. But if you can also produce the drug and can also distribute it on the street, there's a big chance that you can dominate the whole market. First striking thing to remember is there's a town called Afyon in Anatolia, which literally means poppy. Turkish land used to be a mass poppy producer back in the day. So much so that much of the poppy and heroin distributed to the world would be produced in the Anatolian land. The mass hysteria over poppy started in the 19th century thanks to the German chemists who produced morphine. Then Mr. Wright synthesized heroin in 1874, which was supposed to be a less addictive alternative to morphine.
As many good 19th century chemists did, they tasted it to see what it did. And one of them said that it made him feel absolutely wonderful, and they were going to call it wunderlich, the German for wonderful. But another of his colleagues who had taken it said, "This makes me feel heroic." And so they called it heroin.
Both of these chemicals, morphine and heroin, was synthesized from poppy, regular old poppy. When these drugs took off, so did the poppy plantations in Anatolia. This is when the pharmaceutical companies started promoting the pain-relieving qualities of poppy. During the early 20th century, morphine was widely available as an over-the-counter drug.
They were especially used for respiratory and gastrointestinal illnesses. So think cholera, think typhus.
The public health service hospitals in the United States used to dispense heroin at its relief stations up until 1916. During the American Civil War, morphine was administered to tens of thousands of soldiers in the trenches. It was considered an essential part of the medical toolkit. In the 1920s, 30s, Turkey emerges as a major producer of opium, with factories in Istanbul producing legal morphine to the European and Asian markets. One of the well-known factories was located in Kuzguncu. It was a truly international operation. The owners were 2 Turkish Muslims, 2 Armenians, a Mexican, a Belgian. Another key player was the Etkim factory, run by the Taranto family, a wealthy Jewish merchant family which had deep ties to the opium trade in Istanbul. One of Istanbul's smaller factories, Oriental Products Company, was founded by 2 Japanese brothers, Hidetaro and Kijiro Sakan. They were shipping opium from Istanbul to Egypt and from there on to the Asian market, to China, Vietnam and Hong Kong. As the global appetite for opiates grew, so did the temptation to profit from the dark side of the trade. In 1931, League of Nations reported that much of Turkey's morphine wasn't just for hospitals, it was fueling an underground market. By 1928, the French opium imports from Turkey was 3 times the global medicinal requirement. Something was happening underneath. The use of morphine and heroin in the health system and in the army created a growing number of addicts. These people were chasing the opioid high from the street dealers. Some factories began diverting supplies into the illicit market, laying the groundwork for Turkey's future role in the heroin industry.
These are the first artisanal laboratories that will be installed in the area of Bandole, near Marseille. And then they called on chemists who have the know-how, whom they later used in the 1930s, to install what would soon be the French Connection.
After the First Opium War, China had to open its market to opium after the humiliating defeat against the British. Back in the day, the British were the greatest drug dealers of the world. They even fought China, who was concerned about the opium problem. In the mid-19th century, almost 10% of the population in China was hooked. They were addicted.
Might find officials, the highest officials at court, who took a bit of opium to basically relax. You would find middle-class scholars whirling away their time by smoking opium pipes, perhaps in a dedicated opium parlor, or indeed men working in back-breaking labor who would take opium to try and ease the pain in their muscles.
The same trend was prevalent in the Western world too. After the American Civil War, there was a marked increase in morphine addiction among veterans who had been treated with the drug in the trenches. It was estimated that over 400,000 soldiers had become dependent on morphine by the 19th century. Anyone who tried opium knows how addicted they are, how they might even capture you in your first time. This insatiable love story between the opioid receptors and the opioid chemicals fueled the poppy productions in Anatolia.
When opioids enter the brain, they land on tiny docking stations at the end of your nerves called receptors.
Typically, the receptors catch chemical messengers called neurotransmitters to activate your nerve cells.
Opioid receptors do just the opposite. They stop electrical pulses from traveling through your nerve cells, also known as neurons.
This dampening is handy with pain relief.
The visible rise in addiction among veterans and the public became a significant issue. The countries started taking action individually to contain the wave of addiction. However, this was a unique problem which couldn't be solved domestically. It was an international operation after all. The poppy was grown in Anatolia, in Iran. It was processed in labs in Istanbul, Hong Kong, Marseille. It was shipped from Egypt to Japan, from Istanbul all the way to the US. The borders were permeable and the domestic efforts were ineffective. The first international initiative was the Shanghai Opium Commission, where 13 countries met to discuss the gradual suppression of the opium trade. This was quickly followed by the Hague Convention, which laid the groundwork for subsequent international drug control efforts. You see the countries here: the United States of America, China, France. The first article reads, "The contracting powers shall enact effective laws and regulations for the control and production of opium." As the international community strengthened controls, several morphine synthesizing companies relocated to Turkey to circumvent these regulations. This is when the factories in Istanbul were established. But some of these figures who were involved in the factories, who were the shareholders, were shady figures to start with. The Belgian founder of this very long-titled factory, Paul Mechelet, had a notorious reputation in the international drug trade. We know the Taranto family also supplied morphine to the international smuggler Elia Eliopoulos, who operated across Asia and European market. This factory's products found their way into the Eastern market.
2 trunks concealing heroin found in the port town Tianjin was sourced back to Etkim factory of Istanbul, Turkey.
In Turkey, the boundaries between the legal and the illegal had waned. This is what the Western lawmakers took notice of. The US House of Representatives introduced a legislation that would ban the purchase of opium derivatives from countries not adhering to the Hague Convention's prohibitions. Turkey found itself at the crossroads. Poppy had long been a key economic activity for millions of citizens living in Anatolia. But the international pressure was real. This was too much to take for a new nation which was established almost a decade ago. In December 1932, American Ambassador Joseph Grew met Atatürk and other high-ranking officials, urging Turkey to enact definitive legislation to address opium trafficking. Grew highlighted rumors of high-ranking Turkish officials prohibiting from the illicit trade, which was true. Determined to act, Atatürk convened the cabinet the next day. Hours of discussions led to some critical decisions. The international agreements like the Hague Convention, the Geneva Conventions would be upheld. But there was resistance in the parliament too.
Sir, this is a financial issue. Today, 90% of opium producers are villagers, and most of them produce only 2 or 3 okas of opium. Will Ziraat Bank be able to fully pay each of these villagers the 10 or 15 liras they are owed? Or will they have to wait at the doors of Ziraat Bank for days to receive their money?
It turned into a discussion of independence. How dare the Western countries would impose their will on this new nation? Finally, in January, after relentless discussions, the law passed. The number of provinces allowed to cultivate poppy dropped from 62 to just 17. Opium production also plummeted from 200,000 a year to only 80,000. The factories were closed and the poppy production was monopolized by the government. The trend was clear. The international community was determined to put an end to the poppy trade. The Turkish Mafia became global during this gradual suppression of the poppy trade. Between the 30s and 70s, when the poppy production was gradually getting illegal. During this era, the first international mafias emerged. They were built on the foundational structures of the international legal morphine trade. These organizations developed the capacity to process the poppy and distribute it worldwide. I think it is important to zoom into some prominent figures to understand how exactly this came about. The government's efforts to monopolize the poppy production market, of course, didn't work out.
The farmer too holds his illegal opium gum off the market. He knows it can keep indefinitely and that it's as good as gold. Mattress money, dowry money, a bank account for his old age. He showed us where he hides it. The smugglers will pay him 3 times as much for his opium right now illegally as the government will give him. And he knows the price can only go up.
The rules had already been established thanks to the legal morphine trade. There was the French connection connecting Istanbul to Marseille and the European market. There were the civilians who would buy the poppy, process it, and distribute in the US. But during this era, the Turkish Mafia was only a middleman between the global distributors and the local poppy producers.
Sollozzo is known as the Turk. He's supposed to be very good with a knife, but only in matters of business with some sort of reasonable complaint. His business is narcotics. He has fields in Turkey where they grow the poppy.
We talked to a young Turkish smuggler, now retired he says, who told us just how easy it is.
I went down to Afyon. There I found 3 villagers. I told them that I wanted to buy base morphine. I told them that I wanted 30 kilograms. And I agreed to pay them $300 per kilogram. I took the stuff into my car. It had a false compartment underneath. And I drove to Istanbul. There I waited for a couple of days for my exit visa. Then I took the morphine base by myself to Marseille. I had the telephone number of my contact. I called him, and he agreed to pay me $750 a kilogram. So during this first trip, I made a profit of 15,000 American dollars. But the thing is, I was only a small smuggler. There are big businessmen doing this for just big profits.
For example, Hüseyin Eminoğlu of Istanbul worked with Sami Alkori, a powerful drug trafficker in Beirut, to arrange large opium shipments through Turkish ports. For example, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics reports analyzed Vasil Arjan as the largest heroin dealer in Turkey. What he did was he operated a nightclub which served as a front for his drug operation. Basically, he would sell drugs only in Istanbul. In the late 50s, the Turkish Mafia started to develop the capacities to process the opium. Hüsnü Soysal of the big Soysal family was a chemist. He would bribe policemen to obtain acetic anhydride. It should be noted that acetic anhydride is a key chemical converting morphine into heroin. The Turkish citizens were able to process the poppy and produce their own morphine and heroin in underground labs. In 1934, an important underground figure was captured who had worked in the Egyptian market in Istanbul. He confessed to the League of Nations officials that hundreds of underground labs were operating in Turkey without interference and that the state officials were in on the trade. Now, until the 70s, the Turkish Mafia is mostly a middleman. between the big players. They mostly sell opium, rarely heroin, but they're mostly domestic. The Second World War made things harder for smugglers. The borders were dangerous, the potential users were at trenches, just fighting. The Turkish government was sensitive to the international pressure, and they were taking steps to annihilate the poppy industry. The land used for poppy cultivation had dropped from 40,000 to 13,000 hectares. One remarkable event before the 70s is the Gastarbeiter program, initiated in the 50s and 60s by West Germany. It involved agreements with countries like Turkey, Italy, Greece to bring in temporary foreign workers to fill labor shortages caused by post-war economic expansion. Millions of workers, particularly from Turkey, migrated to Germany under this program. The network of Turkish and Kurdish people will be an essential distribution channel later. The Turkish Mafia used these Turkish diaspora networks even in the early days. During a meeting between Turkish Foreign Minister İhsan Çağlayangil and American Ambassador Martin, Çağlayangil mentioned to his counterpart that Turkish police had recently discovered a quantity of heroin hidden in a car carrying Turkish immigrants to Central Europe.
I know Hackney has got the largest Turkish population outside of Germany within Europe, so obviously there's lots of people travelling to and from Turkey into London. Lots of consignments coming to and from Turkey. So that's a massive benefit because you've got the connections back to Turkey. They obviously speak the same language, have the same culture, and they'll have the same routes and same methods of importation for legitimate goods that they can piggyback onto and hide and conceal the illicit drugs within. So it's essential that you have the communities, and we see that with other communities within the UK.
We see the same observations in CIA reports. During this time, there was a seismic shift taking place in the global opioid trade. The poppy plantations had moved away from Iran and Turkey all the way to Afghanistan, thanks to the international pressure. Kurds played a crucial role smuggling the poppy outside Afghanistan to the Middle East, functioning as a bridge between Afghanistan and the Western world. The city appeared to have taken a central role in processing raw opium coming from Afghanistan, replacing the functions once served by Syrian, Lebanese and French traffickers. I think the Balkan route was the last missing element needed to connect the plantations in the east to the end users in the west. On the one hand, the Turkish Mafia had access to poppy. They had a wide network of chemists, underground labs all around Anatolia. On the other hand, they had relatives in Europe, thanks to the worker migration program. They just needed a way to connect these two worlds. And this happened in the 70s. An in-depth CIA study analyzes this very topic.
Overland transport of narcotics by cars, trucks and buses now appears to be the dominant means of smuggling. Smuggling by sea, the leading method of moving narcotics into France a decade ago, has become secondary, although still the source of sizable quantities of narcotics.
The land transportation method described in the report was the Balkan route. It is still in use today. I've been there as well. In a House of Representatives hearing in the US, the Bulgarian government's involvement is made clear.
The purpose of the hearing today is to examine the available evidence on that subject. What is the extent of the government of Bulgaria's involvement in drug trafficking? Our information indicates that Kintex Company was formed in 1968, brought about by the merging of three commercial import-export firms. The directors of Kintex were top-ranking members of the Bulgarian Intelligence Service. As a source of income, the Bulgarians through Kintex became active in assisting the flow of illicit arms and ammunition throughout Europe to the Middle East. The Bulgarians have operated with a wide range of Turkish groups, but their prime instrument has been the Turkish Mafia.
Bulgaria had become a safe haven for Turkish smugglers in the 70s. Under the Bulgarian government's direct control, the company Kintex had orchestrated a drugs for guns scheme. They traded weapons to Middle Eastern groups in exchange for heroin, which was then trafficked to Europe. For example, the drug trafficker Abuzer Uğurlu had worked for Kintex, and he was later granted a Bulgarian citizenship. Uğurlu was one of the first international Turkish mafia boss with a net worth of billions of dollars. He started working with Kintex in 1969. He did the arms for drugs trade back and forth between Europe and Middle East. Journalist Claire Sterling's book on the Sicilian Mafia gives an insight about this operation.
Early in 1976, abuser Uğurlu and his biggest drug partner in Istanbul, Hüseyin Kil, sent a relative of Sil's to Italy to tie up the Sicilian deal. by agreement with the Sicilians when the Turkish and Sicilian traffickers carved up Europe together. Abuser Uğurlu was given his own heroin territory as well. The Turkish Mafia thereupon hired its own Marseille chemists and opened heroin refineries in West Germany and Holland, working in tandem with the Sicilians for distribution.
The trade was very lucrative. The cash from the drug sales in Europe could buy ammunition and guns on the way back. This was a transaction that doubled their profits. Drugs, money, arms, left to right, from west to east, from east to west. This is how the Turkish Mafia made billions of dollars. By the late 1970s, the Turkish Mafia had cemented their role in this very profitable guns for drug scheme. There was Oflu Ismail, who had a reputation in Netherlands and Italy as the wholesaler of heroin and an arms dealer. In 1977, his shipment of 3.7 tons of heroin was caught in the Helena ship in Rotterdam. The ship is still in use today, and now, as we speak, voyaging across somewhere unknown. Interesting. There was Dündar Kılıç, who was arrested on weapons smuggling charges shortly after the 1980s military coup in Turkey. There was the Kurdish Idris, who was arrested for weapons smuggling and faced narcotics trafficking charges. By the 1980s, the Turkish criminal groups had established a complete supply chain, from production to processing, from processing to distribution. Close-knit communities like the Turkish nationalists, the Kurdish nationalists, the Laz communities had passed on their expertise within their own separate circles. Well, this is it really. Once the trade and the know-how was established, it could hardly be forgotten. The next generation followed in the footsteps of these first pioneers. Figures like Mehmet Ali Ağca, Hüseyin Baybaşın, Sedat Peker, Alaaddin Çakıcı, senators would deal drugs in Europe. The nationalization of the mafia, the clash with the Kurdish nationalists, the funding of PKK, the involvement of the deep state, a lot to unpack here. Maybe we do another video if you share around. Share and subscribe. See you around.